In the last video, we explored the esoteric religious triad from a philosophical point of view, and we found that the dyad and triad were implicit properties of the monad represented by the circle. We discovered a key feature of the esoteric triad in this rendering, since it conveyed the idea of two opposites, which are indicated by the plus and minus signs, and their synthesis in a third aspect. This particular orientation of the triad is the most familiar to us, and we find it everywhere in Orthodox Christian symbolism. It is noteworthy because the upward pointing triangle refers to the broader esoteric religious theme of ascent, the ascent from the material world into the transcendent. We find the idea of ascent and descent, that is, the descent of the spirit or higher consciousness into the material world, in religious artworks, in Jewish mysticism, and actually throughout the esoteric religious world. Another Hermetic artwork that we have already looked at carries this idea, while indicating that which is above is like that which is below. The dark downward pointing triad, which emanates from the upper half of this dyad, is fused with the light upward pointing triad formed by the figure reflected in the world below. At first glance, these kinds of artworks and motifs can easily be passed off as imaginative renderings of religious dogmas and fantasies, especially given that there is no shortage of imagination and invention in this sphere. But what I would like to emphasize is that the inner teachings of Jesus, like those mystery schools which preceded and succeeded him, were psychological in character. But we are not used to looking at religious literature from this point of view. The arrows formed by the two triangles in this picture superficially and quite obviously refer to the descent of God through Jesus into the world, and the ascent of Jesus and his true believers into heaven. That is the outward meaning Orthodox religious faithful would draw from this kind of representation. The inner meaning of this particular artwork refers to the individual who is a like representation of God and who likewise will inevitably take an upward trajectory towards psycho-spiritual integration and unity, or a downward trajectory towards psychological disintegration and disunity. The first steps towards integration in this process is the work towards knowing oneself, that is, to strip away the idealized self-image, to become intimate with and unify our disowned, rejected, and strenuously denied psychological characteristics. And this is desperately difficult to do without help, because there are many psychological characteristics within us that we quite definitely do not wish to even see, let alone assimilate. French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, "Hell is other people." What he intended by this was to point out that we are blind to our psychologically disowned material, and so we need the help of those outside of ourselves who have no problem seeing those characteristics we do not see and do not ordinarily wish to see. These generally negative aspects of our psychological makeup are disowned for good reasons, because we are, from a young age, taught that they are ugly and unbecoming, detestable and unacceptable. The process, which eventually leads to the acceptance and reintegration of these features, is inevitably very, very painful. The downward path, represented in this Hermetic artwork, however, is easy and effortless. It does not require self-awareness as understood in Eastern religious practice, but rather it depends on entropy, the unconscious mechanistic processes which inevitably lead to decay and disintegration like everything else in the natural world. We can also view this artwork from an Eastern religious perspective, which takes a point of view that we descend into the material world from the higher conscious realm and in the process lose our transcendent consciousness. So the broad aim of the Eastern religious world is to cultivate and reattain this higher form of consciousness, so that upon our death we can merge with the transcendent consciousness we emanated from. Returning to Flood's artwork, the central divided circle is a schematic representation of our bifurcated psyche. Many informative metaphors and illustrative allegories of the esoteric religious world are based on this schematic, which represents the most important principles that the world, the individual, God, and even our possibilities for psycho-spiritual evolution are based on. The male and female reconciled in the child, heaven and hell, God and Satan, good and evil, or the unconscious and conscious minds reconciled in the individual through the integration of binary opposites. The Christian representation of this principle is by no means unique or primary. Carl Jung, perhaps one of the most brilliant, meticulous, and academically neglected psychiatrists of the modern world, has this to say about the esoteric religious triad. Triads of gods appear very early, at the primitive level. The archaic triads in the religions of antiquity and of the East are too numerous to be mentioned here. Arrangement in triads is an archetype in the history of religion, which, in all probability, formed the basis of the Christian trinity. C.J. Jung, A Psychological Approach to the Dogma of the Trinity. So let's begin with some of these archaic religious triads, since there are, as Jung pointed out, hundreds of examples of triad godheads. We will, in passing, look at a few examples which contain the additional themes of death and resurrection, which feature often enough to be noticed. One of the more interesting and enduring religious triads, which contains strong Christian themes, comes from ancient Egyptian mythology. The supreme male deity Osiris, the supreme female deity Isis, who was originally represented as a human woman before the New Kingdom, and their son Horus. Osiris is often depicted wearing a crown which combines the hedjet, the symbol of Upper Egypt, and ostrich feathers, which represent justice, truth, and authority over the underworld, while the god Set, in time, became associated with Lower Egypt. Osiris was the god of life, death, and resurrection, and he was the judge of the living and the dead. His binary opposite Set was the god of chaos, deceit, violence, and disorder. Horus, much like Jesus, was regarded as a living incarnation of the supreme god Osiris, and the myth describes how Horus, the son of Osiris, conquers Set, and then after death resumes the identity of his father, the supreme god Osiris. Prior to the birth of Horus, this myth also describes how Osiris himself was killed and fragmented before being resurrected and made whole again. So there are obvious thematic similarities in the Egyptian and Christian myths. In the Pharaonic texts, some of the oldest religious literature in the world, each new pharaoh was deigned to be the incarnation of Horus, and then, when each pharaoh dies, he becomes Osiris again, and so the pharaonic lineage was established according to these principles. According to Jung, this concept informed the Christian idea of the soul, since originally it was only the pharaoh who had the inner Osiris, but eventually this notion was picked up and applied to themselves by the masses. There is much in this myth which loosely informs Christian mythology, but there are many other pre-Christian triads which feature the death and resurrection of the son or daughter of the triad godhead. Inanna, the daughter of Nana and Ningal, who in one form or another is perhaps history's most enduring deity, was restored to life after spending 3 days in hell, just as Jesus did. Persephone, the daughter of the supreme male god Zeus and the goddess Demeter, is likewise restored from hell, while Dionysus, the son of Zeus and Persephone, is known as the dying and rising god. Pre-Christian examples of the resurrected god, like the ones we have touched upon, are often criticised as being unrelated to Jesus and the Christian Trinity, because some are associated with agriculture. When winter falls, the god of agriculture goes to hell, and with spring they are restored to earth. This, however, is no reason to dismiss them. The historical archetypal arrangement of gods in triads, their symbolic content, and the themes of life, death, resurrection, and restoration are significant. Whether we find these ideas deified in naturistic cycles or elsewhere, whether they are conscious or unconscious representations, is less interesting than their prevalence and the principles they carry. A thematic order of arrangement features in these Christian and pre-Christian religious triads. The first representation is that of a male god. The second is a female god or mortal woman, and the third is a pre-sexual or sexually amorphous child, or sometimes the historically venerated hermaphrodite. We can also map the relationship of Jesus, God, and humanity using the very same schematic. The idea of Jesus as a third reconciling aspect of God was first fully elaborated by Philos, a first-century Jewish, Neoplatonist and Gnostic, who described the symbolic place of Jesus centuries before the Orthodox Christian Church was born. He wrote, "The absolute being, the Father, who had begotten all things, gave an especial grace to the archangel and firstborn Logos, that standing between he might sever the creature from the Creator. The same is ever the intercessor for the dying mortal before the immortal God, and the ambassador and the ruler of the subject. He is neither without beginning of days, as God is, nor is he begotten, as we are, but is something between these extremes, being connected with both." Jesus, according to Western religious literature, is wholly human and wholly God at the same time, a composite of binary opposite himself, and as such a perfect mediating or reconciling figure between God and man. Jesus, on one hand, is the son of Joseph and his mother Mary, so he is a composite of the opposing male and female dyad. On the other hand, according to the Christian myth, Jesus is the composite of God's Spirit and the mortal woman Mary, which is about as perfect a binary opposite as you can get. The Gnostic representation of Jesus is also interesting because it informed Christianity and was contemporaneous to the early Christian world. In Sethian Gnosticism, the male god's counterpart is the female goddess Barbelo, who is a mirror reflection of him, and Jesus is described as the autogenes, that is, the self-generated son of this pairing. And finally, we can view the Jesus story from a thematic point of view of descent, restoration, and ascent. We find aspects of these in the ancient triads we already mentioned, and they are interesting from a Jungian psychological perspective and from the point of view of individual psycho-spiritual development, which, it seems to me, is the fundamental purpose of these mystery school teachings. In any case, we find the same theme of descent, restoration, and ascent in a beautiful allegorical narrative called the Hymn of the Pearl, ascribed to the Apostle Thomas. It is interesting that this text survived in Orthodox religious literature and was indeed highly regarded for many centuries, probably because it immediately alludes to the Jesus story and, less obviously, to the meaning and purpose of life for the ordinary human being, with an interest in cultivating consciousness. In this story, the hero sets out from a transcendental spiritual realm and descends to earth, where he is clothed in materiality. He becomes immersed in the world and forgets his true nature and his purpose. Eventually, he realizes that his purpose is to steal back the pearl, which symbolically represents the higher conscious self, the treasure of the story. The pearl is guarded by a dragon, which represents a basket of opposing concepts. but particularly the seductive qualities of materiality, which caused our hero to forget his higher conscious self in the first place. Attachment, identification, allurement, entrancement, and the many distractions of the sensuous world. The historical demonization of the material world and practices like asceticism are based on misunderstanding. For self-awareness to have value, like so much else in life, it must be attained through struggle. So the intoxicating qualities of the sensuous world are not evil, but necessary. In some myths, a dragon is to be fought and slain, but Thomas uses an interesting alternative idea. The dragon is instead put to sleep. We'll discuss this idea in its proper context a little later. So our hero overcomes the dragon, steals back the pearl, and ascends in glory to the transcendent realm. But this theme is every bit as Buddhist as it is Christian. The Buddhists take the point of view that our descent from the pleroma, the source, nirvana or sunyata, which are strikingly similar ideas, into the earthly realm is cyclic. And we break this cycle by attaining enlightenment. After death, we return to the transcendent and have no need to be reborn again. The orthodox rendering of the Christian trinity obfuscates the implicit foundational ideas of the religious triad, which are well represented in its own doctrine. In this rendering, Jesus replaces the mother, although the historical feminine attributes reflected in his teaching are quite evident. Love, the Sacred Heart, forgiveness, understanding, compassion. The Holy Spirit is disembodied from the parent-child triadic metaphor, although etymologically it means the holy mind. So we find in French and German, for instance, the words for mind, l'esprit and Geist, which mean the ghost and spirit respectively. If we compare the story of the Pentecost with Eastern descriptions of enlightenment and what comes with it, then it is quite clear that the descent of the Holy Spirit in Pentecost refers to enlightenment or self-awareness. Perhaps the Christian rendering is a product of religious patriarchal contrivance. Perhaps it represents a deliberate distancing from the triad godheads of antiquity. Or perhaps, as the Gnostics pointed out during the establishment of the early church, the orthodox point of view represented only a superficial understanding of the Christian teaching. The processional ordering and dynamic of religious triads, however, cannot be attributed to patriarchal whim. In a generative sense, sperm moves from the father to the mother, and the child issues from the mother's body. The child is often depicted as a male, so that as a male adult, the process can continue as a cycle. So the esoteric religious triad symbolically represents three core ideas that are entirely missing from the orthodox religious narrative. The most important of these is that it represents two binary opposites and the reconciliation of these in a third aspect of the triad. The second is the flow or direction indicated by descent, restoration or resurrection, and ascent. And the third is a symbolism of number in religious literature. Since the orthodox interpretation of the Holy Trinity completely obfuscates these ideas, the symbolism of number, which is evident throughout the Old and New Testaments, is completely missed. But if we consider the story of Jesus, it is immediately clear that he represents the third principle, and so the number 3 is attributed to him everywhere in the New Testament. His ministry lasted 3 years. He promises to destroy and rebuild the temple in 3 days. En route to crucifixion, the cock crows 3 times. He's denied 3 times by the Apostle Peter. He stumbles 3 times, speaks 3 last words before he dies at 3 p.m. He descends into hell and is resurrected after 3 days. In the next video, we will explore the 3 principles or forces described in Gnosticism, Gurdjieffian ideology, and Jewish mysticism, which inform the esoteric religious triad, Jungian psychology, and physics. Thanks for listening.